Hello, my name is Mackenzie Cooke, and I'm going to be presenting on my field agency placement for the Master's in Social Work program at Denver Metro. So as you can see, my poster presentation is my PowerPoint, and the Adopt International is a domestic and international adoption placing agency. So we help families find children, and we also help them complete home studies so that they can adopt children. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. So Adopt International is a private nonprofit agency. It was started in 1983 by our current director, Lynn Silver. She actually was deemed ineligible to adopt as a single woman, and so she decided she was going to start her own adoption agency. She had spent a lot of time internationally at different orphanages and had a lot of connections with different countries, and was able to start a really good program with international adoption. We also expanded to do domestic adoption because we were finding that a lot of families also were wanting to adopt domestically. My supervisor, Lisa Clark, she is the one who runs our domestic program, and she is a huge advocate for birth mothers. So one of the big things I'm learning about is how important it is to advocate for domestically for our birth mothers, who are actually very involved in healthy relationships with these families who adopt domestically. Our mission is to recognize the right of every child in the United States and throughout the world to find a loving, permanent family who will meet his or her individual needs. And as I said before, we support open adoption plans only, and that's for our domestic program, of course, because with international programs it's harder to have open relationships. But what open adoption is it's a connection that the birth families have with their adoptive families, so that they can still have a relationship with the children that they have relinquished. And there's been a lot of studies on this that shows that that's the healthiest way. So that is one of our policies at the agency. The next slide talks a little bit about what we do. It's the what. So we do home studies, we have a domestic program, an international program, and we support our birth families. One of the brochures that I brought is our domestic and international services brochure. It goes into all the things that a home study does. It does background checks, it helps to educate families about adoption, it helps them answer any questions that they have. It also helps us to kind of weed out families that really, are you really open for an open adoption, and are you really trying to do a domestic adoption, or is international more maybe for you? We also help families decide if they're going to do transracial adoptions, because that's an entire other piece of adoption and education and awareness that's really important. We want our families to be open to and aware of different cultures and understand that while they might be open to having a child that doesn't look like them, they need to be aware about how that will affect their child growing up. So we do use the home studies to sort of go in depth with that, and just be there for all of the questions that our families have. Our brochure talks about open adoptions. It talks about Hague compliance with international adoptions, and it goes into all of the logistics about things that we do and any questions that people might have. So that's a good one that students can look at if they're interested in this agency. Another brochure that I brought that I thought was really interesting was the brochures that we give to educate birth families. So birth mothers who are deciding whether or not they want to relinquish their children, who have reached out to our agency for maybe placing their children for adoption, we give them this pamphlet, which just goes into all the supports that we offer for them. Really that we are their advocate, and that sort of just educating them on the laws about adoption. They, while they might decide to relinquish their child, they actually have 30 days after the relinquishment to sign papers that officially place their child in a different adoptive home. So if they decide that they're unhappy with the adoptive family that they have chosen, or if they do decide that they want to parent, they have 30 days legally to be able to do that. So this just talks about, those important logistics and education pieces. It also talks about our staff and the amount of experience that we have in dealing with birth families and adoptions, and educating them on the positives and negatives and being real about what can happen. Since I'm talking about brochures, I'm just going to mention this one too. We also have a no spanking policy at our adoption agency. So one of the pieces in the home study that we educate families about is using different forms of discipline other than corporal punishment. So we do have parents sign a form saying that they will not spank. And this goes into talking about spanking, and especially with adoptive children, mostly from international adoptions, but how important it is not to use physical punishment with your children. Okay, our next slide talks about our clients, and I've talked a little bit about this already, but our clients include single men and women, heterosexual couples, and same-sex partners, as well as families. So if families already have children but still want to adopt, we take them as well. We take anyone, anywhere in between. One of the big things that Lynn Silver, our director, wanted to emphasize was that a family looks completely different from all walks of life, and there shouldn't be any sort of regulations about what that family looks like. We've had single dads, single moms, families, same-sex couples, and we have had great success with working with all of those families. And we want to be a resource for families who might be oppressed in other agencies and be told that they can't adopt. We want to be the one to tell them that they can. And our birth parents. So sometimes we have birth mothers, sometimes we also have birth fathers, and sometimes we have birth families. So sometimes not just the birth mother, but also her parents or the birth father's parents might want to be involved in the adoption process, and might want the piece of education that we offer to all of our birth families. So while our birth families are not paying clients, they are still people that we advocate for, and we consider them clients. And we never make them pay for anything. The adoptive families are always the people who are paying for the services. Our services are free for all birth families. Children of adoption, adoptive families, and anyone with questions, we provide a lot of services and classes. We have even what's called a Healthy Families membership program, and that is for adoptive families and children of adoption who are really looking for answers to questions that they might have, or when families say, okay, I know you gave us all this information before we were adopting, but now my kid is 9 and asking where he came from, what do we do? So we kind of help aid families who are seeking some experience or some questions, or even families who are looking for other adoptive families. Maybe, we don't have any friends who adopted from China. Can you tell us about if you had any clients who adopted from China as well? So we put on different parties. We have one coming up called our Love Party, in which adoptive families can get together. And it really gives them an experience to form a community of adoptive families. And especially if they're international adoptions, it's children from certain countries that might sort of form these little groups, which is really good because it's more support for the adoptive process. Okay, this is the how. The how talks about how we serve our values and goals. So our agency, like I have said, emphasizes the rights of birth parents and birth mothers. One thing I don't think I mentioned is that birth parents who have reached out to us before they've given birth, who are looking for adoptive families, we like to tell adoptive families that the baby's not yours until she signed the papers. So if she's drinking coffee and eating a bunch of pizza and burgers and something that the adoptive family might never do, we say it's her choice, it's her body, and it's still her baby until she signed the papers. So that, I think, was one of the hardest pieces for me to kind of wrap my head around, because it's not this business of buying babies, and they don't get to have a say. We're not a surrogacy program. We're really there to support birth parents. And while we are an adoptive agency, we also know that legally the rights of the birth parent are her rights, and that's her baby until she signs the papers. So we just want to make sure that's who we're really advocating for. So that's how we advocate. We also encourage, as I mentioned before, open adoption plans because of that importance. We educate people on the relinquishment process. So the relinquishment process can look different in every state, sometimes even different in different counties. And of course, internationally, every country, it looks different. So this is basically the legal side of it, the signing of the papers and the actual adoption process. So we do a lot of awareness and education about that. We also do post-placement and post-adoption services. So I talked a little bit about I'd already talked about our post-adoption services, but the post-placement is an important piece of adoption which goes into the family's lives after they have completed an adoption. So we have different requirements, again, for different states, for different countries, but oftentimes it's within the first 30 days of the parents receiving the child. And then we do one typically, again, either 60 days later or 3 months later, around that time. And with different countries, like China has this going for the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years. So some post-adoption services look different. Our domestic program, it's pretty much just for the first year that we go in, but just making sure that the family is adjusting and the child is forming an attachment, and all those really crucial pieces to adoption. So that's a huge part of what we do as well. So just as the home studies are sort of the before the adoption, the post-placements are the after the adoption. All that paperwork and kind of interviewing and education process. And then, of course, adoption as a lifelong process. We understand that families, it doesn't just end once they receive the child. They're going to have questions for the rest of their lives. And as my director, she's had actually adopted 3 children. So she knows, even now with grown children, questions are still asked and family still wants to know, and there's still things that come up every once in a while, and an adoptive family is always an adoptive family, and there's always going to be services provided for those families as well. Okay, here is the why. Why do we do what we do? And why it matters. So I wrote charity work, question mark. We actually recently had a situation where a family adopted from a pretty poor country called the Marshall Islands, which is part of it's in the Philippines, Indonesia area. And they adopted we have a program, it's called our Marshall Islands program, and there's very needy families there. And the families to adopt, they're required to spend at least a month in the Marshall Islands, because once they get there, that's when they do the adoption, and then they have to wait about 30 days to get a court date to actually approve the adoption. So not only are they aware of the poverty, they actually are enriched in the culture and see the poverty firsthand. So we had a family that was giving money to their birth family, and sort of looking at their adoption, they felt almost guilty that they were going home with this baby and that this family was still left there, and they just felt like they needed, that was their contribution, is that they needed to keep paying this birth mother. Other families we have come in and they say, I want to adopt those poor African children that I've been seeing on TV, or I want to help with the drug birth mothers. And it's a lot of these stereotypes that people come into, and they're thinking the reason that they want to adopt is to save the world and to do charity. But really, that's not what adoption is about. And I think a huge piece is sort of letting parents be okay with, it's not a charity. You really are benefiting from someone else's inability to parent. And while that's really difficult for some people to understand, we also want them to know, if you start giving money, that's baby buying. And you're basically buying the baby because you're supporting this family, and you're not adopting because you want to be